Welcome back everybody, it is I, and today we're going to be doing a breakdown of the INTJ personality type. I already finished the free Oddly Specific INTJ things, so I'll leave a link for that in the description down below if you want to check that out. As per usual with these videos, I'll be giving a breakdown of the INTJ's cognitive functions, the functions that make up the INTJ ego. I'll be giving a little bit of an example of like what the vibe is of an INTJ. What happens when you bring those cognitive functions together? What is that kind of person presenting as? How do they feel? We'll be giving a bit of a breakdown of some of the potential strengths and weaknesses for the INTJ personality. And we'll finish off as per usual with a list of examples where I'll kind of give you the INTJ pattern in a system or an example. I'll give you something that strikes me as very INTJ. Okay, so let's get into the cognitive functions that make up the INTJ ego. So the primary function in the INTJ ego is introverted intuition. Intuition is essentially about what isn't. Where sensation is about what actually is right in front of us, intuition is imagination. It's concerned with possibility. Extroverted intuition is concerned with exploring possibilities, so it's divergent. Introverted intuition is concerned with refining possibilities, it's convergent. It's intuition that tends to pull in, synthesize, and it's very much focused on the path ahead and also what has came before it. So it's looking a little bit beneath the surface, or a lot beneath the surface, I think, actually a lot of the time for the INTJ. And it's sort of peering in and making sense of it. Introverted intuition is very much about watching the mind form patterns over time and watching systems form patterns. So it's noticing how this larger system envelops out of, and it's compressing it down so it can understand it very well. So that's sort of the function that the INTJ is using most of the time. They're very in their heads kinds of people. They're very concerned with noticing the patterns, noticing where things are going, what's came before it. They're trend oriented. The secondary function for the INTJ, so what they're using just next to their introverted intuition, is extroverted thinking. Extroverted thinking is concerned with segmenting and taking action on information. So extroverted thinking is structuring the system. So it's looking at the system out there, and then it's like, okay, here's this structure. How do we take action and make this thing happen? So you can imagine how this works with introverted intuition for the INTJ, because there's a sense of, here's the path ahead. It's like, here's the blueprint. Here's the thing that we're primarily focused on, the concept, the idea. And then extroverted thinking is hooking into that, and it's layering. It's layering the pattern. It's actually laying it down in reality. So extroverted thinking is very concerned with what is practical, what is rational, what makes sense to the group, what is the common consensus, and then how do we actually apply the information to make something in reality out there about it. So introverted intuition is the blueprint, and extroverted thinking is laying down what needs to happen so the blueprint can be completed. And this is a major part of the INTJ pattern that you'll notice. INTJs are very concerned with realizing and actualizing the potential. So they are first and foremost a visionary, where the ENTJ would be first and foremost practical and rational. The INTJ is first and foremost a visionary. They're visualizing what the thing is primarily, and then they're actually taking actions to lay it down. But as a secondary function, just like any type, the secondary function tends to develop a bit more over time. It's not usually just, you don't usually just hit like 18 years old with full development of your secondary function. So maybe a younger INTJ has not really maybe figured out how to actually start layering those decisions and actualizing that potential yet. But nevertheless, as a secondary function, the INTJ is very concerned with realizing their potential, realizing the concept out in reality. So that's the second function, extroverted thinking. So the tertiary, the third function there for the INTJ below extroverted thinking, is introverted feeling. Introverted feeling is all about the refinement of different feelings, right? So it's when you refine feelings down over time, you come to a sense of value. For me as an INFP, introverted feeling is in my primary slot, so everything is kind of all about refining feelings down to values to me. That's kind of like my light in life, is actually that felt sense of what's right. For the INTJ though, it's not really that simple because their introverted feeling is in their tertiary slot. It's more of a childlike function for them. So introverted feeling is usually to do more with just like how they feel in the moment about it so much. Like obviously it can develop morally over time, and there's a sense of here's the right path forward. I mean, again, you have that strategizing sense of like, this is the path that we want to take, here's how we're going to do it, and it feels right. I feel aligned with it. Like introverted feeling is all about alignment. It's about having a sense of, I feel right about what this is inside of myself. But for a younger, maybe less mature INTJ, they can get in that kind of NI-FI loop there, and there can be a sense of, this is kind of like what I feel like I want to do now, and then I'm just seeing what I feel there, and my feelings and my foresight are kind of in this loop, and maybe right now all I can really see ahead is I just want to do these things that I want to do today. So I'm still using foresight, but I don't have the bigger structured vision for what my purpose is and what I actually really want to be doing long term. So instead I'm just looking at how I want to feel right now, and that's how that looping can kind of occur. So introverted feeling is more about morals, it's more about how I feel, and it's the refinement and sort of like the pulling in of emotion and feeling there. The lowest function for the INTJ and the INTJ ego is extroverted sensation, extroverted sensing. Extroverted sensation is concerned with what actually is right now. So it's the present moment sense of reality, like what is here right now, and it's on an axis there with introverted intuition. And with extroverted sensing, you get a sense of wanting to actually have impact on reality. So you could say it's like force. There's a sense of, I have control over the situation, and then I'm gonna like, yeah, I'm moving through life and I'm interacting with reality directly. But you can see how this kind of constitutes as a bit of a problem oftentimes for the INTJ, because although that extroverted sensing is aspirational, so deep down, the INTJ does actually want to interact with reality. They want to interact with reality directly. They go in a kind of truncated way where they tend to want to understand reality, and then they feel comfortable interacting with it. Where if you have a type who's extroverted sensing dominant, and then they have introverted intuition on an axis, you get what I mean, they tend to want to interact with reality, and then over time they form like an understanding of how it works and sort of like the convergent intuition about it. But for the INTJ, it's understanding first. So as I get into the vibe in the example in a minute, you'll see what I mean by that, where there's a sense of maybe being a bit stuck in the head a lot of the time. But as this develops over time, you have a fantastic visionary who can interact with reality directly, who can have an impact on reality, and also can see ahead miles and miles and miles further than anyone else. So this can be incredible for an INTJ as they develop. Okay, so we've gone over the cognitive functions. Let's give you a bit of an example of what the INTJ vibe is like. So what is actually the vibe of an INTJ? How does it feel talking to an INTJ? How does it feel like being in the presence of an INTJ? INTJs tend to be people who are primarily focused with understanding and seeing the path ahead. Like I said, they're introverted intuitive dominance. So they tend to be quite careful and structured thinkers. I think of INTJs as being quite skeptical a lot of the time. They're not just going to take some information in and assume like, oh, okay, sounds good, makes sense. It's like, no, they're going to want to understand how the system works. They're also going to want to understand how you came to that conclusion. If you give them information, they're not going to take it for face value. They're going to want to understand why that information is correct and what is it based off of, what is the structure of it. And their extroverted thinking there kicks in because they're going to explore, tune into the minds of different people, and they're going to extract what is valuable, and then usually they're going to extrapolate on it to some degree, and they're going to kind of synthesize those different understandings together. So you have someone who is very investigative, very skeptical, and a very keen and careful thinker. I want to really paint a picture here of you for someone who is actually using that kind of thinking and that kind of envisioning for its own sake. A lot of times INTJ does kind of get, they get kind of denoted as a strategist. And yes, they are a strategist, but the strategy is really the fusion of TE and NI there. But I really want to make sense of the fact that Introverted intuition comes first for an INTJ. So the vibe that you tend to get is someone who is quite cerebral, someone who's quite concerned with making sense of things. I often notice with INTJs as well, there's a sense of composure, almost as if their physical vehicle, like their body, is quite secondary. It's like you can notice there can be kind of a stillness. You can also notice that they don't tend to be as concerned with the pressing needs of the moment. They might not necessarily notice that they haven't eaten for a few hours if they're caught in thought about something, or they're contemplating something, or they're looking to understand some kind of model. They might not necessarily notice that. So there's a sense of most of the awareness and the energy kind of going up to the head, and there being a very penetrating observation underneath the surface. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a feeling for what the INTJ vibe is like. Someone who's very cerebral, very skeptical, a very careful thinker, and someone who is very adept at noticing patterns, especially as they mature and they develop over time. But also, as I said, there can be a looping between NI and FI there. So you might see someone who is actually kind of caught in a feeling right now in that moment. They're actually caught in how they feel about something, and they can't really break out and see the path ahead. That's why it can be really useful for an INTJ to have someone who utilizes extroverted intuition a bit more, me, in their life sometimes, because it's a sense of like, well, I can paint a different picture and it's not as honed in, it's more broad, it's more open, it's more divergent. And because they have extroverted sensing inferior like that, there can be a sense of being a bit indulgent. I mean, something like, maybe picking up some bad habits or something like that, and getting a bit stuck there, and getting stuck in that SE and that FI, and just kind of like, oh, this is what feels right now. But at their best, INTJs tend to be fantastic strategists with very clear thinking, and people who can really help you in terms of seeing the path ahead and how this system, how this structure came together and how it was formed over time. Let's talk about some of the potential strengths and weaknesses for the INTJ personality type. So we'll start off with strengths. One strength I notice for the INTJ, as I've kind of already honed in on a lot here, but let's say it again. For the INTJ, they have a fantastic ability to chart the course. They're very good at mapping out what's going to happen. They know the steps to get there as well, oftentimes. And because their thinking is often quite careful and quite precise, they'll be able to pick up on what a potential problem might be. They won't just jump to the thing and then see what happens. They'll have thought about what could potentially go wrong in their going in this direction. So their thinking tends to be very precise and very careful. I see that as a major strength for the INTJ because they can save themselves a lot of hassle. Another strength for the INTJ is they tend to be quite independent. They tend to make sense of a situation in how they think of it. They don't really need a lot of connection around them a lot of the time. I think oftentimes there's the stereotype of an INTJ as being quite cold and quite emotionless. I don't really think it's that they're cold as such. They just tend to be more independent, and they tend to be more focused on what they're thinking is the right thing to do. But they definitely, obviously, need connections with other people. They value having great, high-quality connections with other people. But they also tend to be very independent, and I see that as a strength for an INTJ a lot of the time, that sense of sovereignty of mind, having a sense of how I think, and you're not just going to tell me what to think, but I'm going to make sense of it for myself. I'm going to assess if it's legit, and then I'm going to take action on it if it is. I see that as a big old strength for the INTJ personality. Building on that last point, INTJs, they're really not very likely to get hoodwinked by a point of view very easily. Like I said, they're quite skeptical a lot of the time. So there tends to be a sense of, you're giving me some information, I'm going to decipher what's valuable out of it, and I'm not just going to buy in. And this can be a big problem, especially in the world that we live in now, because we're in the age of information, right? We're in the age of social media, and there's tons of different, there's information that may be true, may be untrue. It's very ambiguous and interpretive. It just kind of gets thrown around. And a lot of the time, it's very easy to just want to sort of tack onto something and assume that that's the truth, especially if someone speaks it with a lot of conviction in front of you. But INTJs, I think, are sort of our saving grace here in a way, because they tend to pick through that information. And again, they're very focused on how that conclusion was formed. So careful and concise thinking and structure, I really want to hone in on that being a major strength for the INTJ personality. They have a real unique talent there, and it's very important in the kind of world that we live in today. The visionary capacity of an INTJ is very mobile. It's very much about progress and things actually taking place. They're not the kinds of people to be stuck in inertia and in a sense of like, oh, this is just kind of how it is. Like, I mean, sure, they might get stuck in the grip of extroverted sensing, or they might get stuck in the loop of NI-FI, as we mentioned. But generally speaking, when they're at their best, when they're in their NI flow, INTJs are looking ahead. They're progress oriented. They say what they mean. There's a sense of here's what I mean and here's what I want to do about it, and I want to make that happen. They're not just going to get stuck in the same old thing. And we need this in the world, right? We need visionaries. We need vision, because if there was no one dreaming the path forward, acknowledging the possibilities of what could occur, we would stagnate. And as we stagnate, we would eventually degrade downward, and we would perish, because there's no sense of actually visualizing what's possible. So the INTJ is very adept at this. And this is the soul calling, in my opinion, of the INTJ personality, is to actually envision what's possible and get us to take action on it, get themselves to take action on it. So there's some big old strengths for the INTJ personality. I felt my heart get involved in that one. So what are some of the potential weaknesses and drawbacks for the INTJ personality type? One that I can see very easily is that there's an ungroundedness. When there is so much focus going into what could be and how it's going to exist in the future, or what it meant in the past, there can be a very stark disconnect from the moment, in a sense. And sure, you're actually using introverted intuition in the moment, but the actual physical space in the moment, getting rest and actually just tuning in, being present, connecting with another person in front of you for what they are, not what they could be or what they have done, but just who I am right in front of you, the situation as it is right in front of you. This can be very challenging for an INTJ, and I can see it as a fallback and a weakness, the ungroundedness of having so much energy go up into your mind a lot of the time. As I mentioned in strengths, the sense of looking forward and the magnificent sense of possibility, that can also be viewed in a very negative way. I want to make that clear to you. There can be a sense of negatively viewing the path forward, but more particularly for the INTJ, it tends to be seeing that it didn't work before and feeling like giving up. There can be a sense of not really being able to see how there might be a magnificent path forward, and then this incredible strength can kind of turn into a weakness. So there can be a sense of looking back in the past and just not really feeling like there is a path forward, not really feeling like there is a lot of possibility moving forward. And I think this can be a major drawback and a weakness for the INTJ if it's not checked, and you don't have the kind of relationship in your life where someone's actually painting the possibilities, someone's actually helping you move through some of the blockages in your own thinking. Although the INTJ is going to be very careful and very skeptical of how they think, they are just as likely as anyone else to get paradigm locked. I mean, that is possible for everyone. It's not just INFJs who face that with the NITI. It can happen for an INTJ as well. Kind of adding on to the ungroundedness I mentioned first, there can be a sense of not really paying attention to present moment needs, in the sense that maybe you haven't eaten today, maybe you haven't taken a shower today, maybe you haven't actually done the things right in front of you that are actually really important, but although you might understand conceptually as an INTJ that they are important and they are valuable, they're not vivid in the way that your imagination and your exploration is. So there can be a sense of sort of devaluing what's right in front of you, because there's extroverted sensing inferior. It's aspirational, so there's a sense of knowing that that is really important and you want to develop that. But there is also a sense of it might not feel as vivid to you right now. So there has to be sort of a discipline developed in order to manage the needs of the moment, what actually is happening in everyday life right now, and also be able to give freedom and space for the imagination to do what it does best and to explore and to find new possibilities and to dig deeper than. The last drawback or weakness that I'm going to mention here, and there are going to be more strengths and weaknesses that I'm mentioning. I'm just kind of giving you a bit of a feel for how this kind of, I want you to see the pattern here. I don't want you to just think, oh, okay, that's what an INTJ is. It's like, no, an INTJ is a whole person, and a whole person is so much more complex than any model will ever do justice to. But we're getting an idea of how the INTJ's functions work as a kind of a pattern here. So just keep that in mind as we go forward. So in saying that, the last weakness will be, for the INTJ, there can be a sense of being misperceived as cold or kind of like robotic in a way. And again, there's a sense of peering underneath and trying to make sense of all the time. A lot of the time, the social interaction we have, the social conventions that we have, they're very FE based. They're very much about, oh, everyone's needs met in the situation. Can we just sort of like rotate around? Do you feel good? Yeah, I feel good too. And it's like, everything's good. But the INTJ is going to appear quite strange in a lot of circumstances if he's in a room of FE people, because he's going to be noticing, or she's going to be noticing, a sense of like, what is actually going on here? Like, they're going to be more preoccupied with trying to understand what's happening rather than just engaging with it for the sake of it. So, although it's not really a weakness as such, a drawback for the INTJ can be the sense of being misperceived or misunderstood as kind of cold and not really very interactive. The INTJ definitely has that interactivity there. They definitely have a lot of spirit and a lot of openness. It's just that it's not engaged directly with SE and FE directly. It's engaged over time. Like, there's a sense of understanding, and when there's a bit of understanding, a bit of engagement follows it. But they are using that process a bit differently to what a lot of people do. The INTJ statistically is quite a rare personality type. It's not the kind of personality type that just pops up in 5 out of 10 people. And when someone thinks and behaves a bit differently to what we're used to, we have a tendency to want to bracket them and put them in a box and say, you're really weird, you're really strange, or we're going to diagnose you with this and that. But it's like, no, their process of interacting with reality is completely valid. It actually is very important as well. But it can be hard to see that a lot of the time when we just want everyone to fit into our perfect categories and everyone to be easy to hang out with, everyone to be easy to understand. It's not going to work like that a lot of the time for the INTJ. So if you're an INTJ watching this, by the way, and you feel that, you get that, I empathize with you. And that is really difficult. And I know what that is like myself. I'm not an INTJ, I'm an INFP. But I do understand what it means a lot of the time to want to peer beneath the surface and to understand and to have deeper questions in your mind and in your heart, and feeling like that's not being satisfied by the group around you. So just know that you have my empathy, and someone does understand it. It's not an easy thing to go through. Okay, so at the end of these videos, I always give a list of examples, and I want to explain, as I always do, that these examples, they're not necessarily INTJ things in the sense that these examples weren't created by INTJs. They're just things out in the world that you can kind of look at the pattern and the structure of this thing, and you can see how it sort of resembles the INTJ cognitive function. So definitely don't take it as just like, oh, he's saying that this example is made by an... It's like, no, I'm not saying it's made by an INTJ. I'm just saying that if you look at the example and you get kind of like a feeling for it, you sort of get you get where I'm going with it. You'll see that there's an INTJ similarity to it. So I'm only going to give you a few here for the INTJ, but see if you can kind of follow along and get a feeling for why I'm actually saying this. So the first example I have for you is actually Dungeon Masters from the game Dungeons and Dragons. If you know what Dungeons and Dragons is, it's basically a very interactive board game where there's certain different people playing different characters, and there is ultimately a big quest or a campaign for the game, and that campaign is orchestrated by the Dungeon Master, and the Dungeon Master is basically someone who writes down and makes sense of what this campaign is going to be. They come up with the story, they structure it, and then people play and they interact with the different enemies, and they kind of go on a bit of like a micro Joseph Campbell's hero's journey there. It's actually a really awesome game. And the reason that I think Dungeon Masters kind of resemble INTJ functions is that there's a sense of structuring this whole landscape, making sense of how everyone, like what different avenues and possibilities everyone could go down. And then there's a sense of knowing how those different things are going to play out. And then everyone's kind of like fixating on the thing, and we're trying to get past this troll or this oak, we're trying to get through this bridge, or we're stuck in a thicket or a forest. And the INTJ there, in my mind, the reason it's very INTJ is because they've already seen the path ahead. They know what the possibilities are. And then that extroverted thinking is structuring the landscape at the same time. So Dungeon Masters, Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Masters strike me as very NITE. I hope you see what I mean there. I know it's a bit of a weird example, but if you get it, you'll get it. The second example that I want to give you is The Art of War by Sun Tzu. When you think of a personality type like an ISTP, when I think of an ISTP, I think of tactics. I think of the structure has been set and the ISTP is going out to enact the thing, right? They're not necessarily concerned with the questioning process or like why it came together. The INTJ is, though. So when you read something like The Art of War by Sun Tzu, there's not just this sense of having tactics and going out and like having a fight. There's a sense of strategy. The INTJ is primarily focused on strategy. So there's a strong sense of how is this going to actually play out? What could happen next? How can we actually use the enemy's strengths as a weakness against them? How can we actually make sense of this over time? I'm not saying that INTJs are all going to be focused on military strategy. I'm just saying the sense of Sun Tzu's The Art of War and strategy in general, it is a very INTJ thing. It's making sense of how different odds and possibilities will play against one another and how they can be utilized for an advantage to move forward. It's kind of like a sense of having a blueprint and then building the house on top of it. So Sun Tzu's The Art of War strikes me as a very INTJ thing. Another example in a similar breath to The Art of War is the Book of Five Rings by, I forget the pronunciation for the name, but I'll leave it there. The Book of Five Rings is not just a book about fighting with swords and martial arts. It's taking a deeper look of the attitude that is required there, the structure and the system that is required there to actually engage in sword fighting as an art form, martial arts as an art form. With the INTJ pattern, there is a strong emphasis on mastery. There's a strong emphasis on taking this thing and turning it into something that is really competent, really powerful, and really, really masterful as a process. So the Book of Five Rings, The Art of War, I see this as this sense of like not just having tactics and going about something and just doing it, but it's a sense of having, making an art form out of this, making something masterful about it, understanding how it all operates, and then heading it forward, heading the charge forwards. I really do like that example of there being the INTJ being something of an architect in a way. I'm calling the INTJ an architect in these videos because there is a sense of having a blueprint and having a structure and then seeing how that thing ultimately plays out. I think this is an incredible element of the INTJ personality overall. Okay, so that's it for my examples list. And that's it for everything else. That's the whole video. Thank you so much for tuning in and for watching this one. If you got value out of it or you learned something new, I really appreciate you liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing this to anyone you feel like would get value out of it. I hope you're having a beautiful day, and that's me.